The evolution of a revolutionary mind. Malcolm X stands as one of the most transformative figures in Black American history, a man whose journey from street hustler to international human rights advocate represents the power of self-determination and intellectual evolution. His life story embodies the struggle of Black people in America and the ongoing fight for dignity, justice, and true equality. Early life, seeds of resistance. Malcolm Little was born on May 19, 1925, in Omaha, Nebraska, the fourth of 8 children to Earl and Louise Little. His father, Earl, was a Baptist preacher and devoted follower of Marcus Garvey's Black nationalism movement. The family faced immediate threats from white supremacists who opposed Earl's activism and Garvey's message of Black pride and self-reliance. When Malcolm was just 4 years old, the family moved to East Lansing, Michigan, seeking a safer environment. But white hostility followed them. The Black Legion, a white supremacist group, burned down their home in 1929. 2 years later, tragedy struck when Earl Little was found dead on streetcar tracks, his body mangled. While authorities ruled it an accident, the family believed he was murdered by white supremacists. Louise Little, left to raise 8 children alone during the Great Depression, struggled with poverty and the psychological trauma of her husband's death. The welfare system, dominated by white social workers, interfered constantly in their family life, questioning Louise's ability to care for her children. The pressure eventually caused a mental breakdown, and she was institutionalized in 1939. The children were scattered among foster homes and state institutions. These early experiences of systemic racism, family destruction, and institutional neglect planted seeds of anger and resentment in young Malcolm that would shape his worldview for years to come. He witnessed firsthand how white supremacy could destroy Black families and communities, lessons that would later fuel his revolutionary consciousness. The making of Detroit Red. As a teenager, Malcolm moved to Boston to live with his half-sister, Ella, who represented dignity and Black middle-class success. However, Malcolm was drawn to the street life of Roxbury's South End, where he discovered a world of hustling, gambling, and survival by any means necessary. In Boston and later in Harlem, Malcolm transformed himself into Detroit Red, a street-smart hustler involved in numbers running, drug dealing, and burglary. He straightened his hair with lye in a painful process called conking, attempting to look more like white society's standard of beauty. This period represented Malcolm's complete alienation from any positive Black identity or sense of purpose. The streets taught Malcolm harsh lessons about survival, but they were also a form of self-destruction. He was running from the pain of his childhood and the limitations placed on Black people in American society. Crime became both his rebellion against and his capitulation to a system that offered few legitimate opportunities for young Black men. In 1946, at age 20, Malcolm was arrested for burglary and sentenced to 10 years in prison. This arrest would prove to be the turning point that redirected his life toward greatness. Prison, the University of Malcolm X. Malcolm later called prison his university, and indeed, his 6.5 years behind bars transformed him completely. Initially angry and defiant, earning the nickname Satan from fellow inmates, Malcolm began a journey of self-education that would reshape his mind and soul. The transformation began when his brother, Reginald, introduced him to the teachings of the Nation of Islam and its leader, Elijah Muhammad. The nation's message that the white man was the devil and that black people were the original inhabitants of the earth provided Malcolm with a framework to understand his experiences of racism and oppression. Malcolm threw himself into studying the nation's teachings and began a rigorous program of self-education. He copied pages from the dictionary to improve his vocabulary and handwriting. He read voraciously history, philosophy, religion, and literature. He studied the histories of Africa and Asia, learning about great black civilizations that had been erased from his education. This intellectual awakening coincided with his spiritual conversion to Islam as taught by the nation. Malcolm began to see his past life of crime and self-hatred as products of white supremacist psychological warfare against black people. He developed a disciplined and analytical mind that would make him one of America's most formidable intellectuals and speakers. Rise in the Nation of Islam. Released from prison in 1952, Malcolm became one of the Nation of Islam's most effective ministers and recruiters. He dropped his slave name of Little and became Malcolm X, the X representing his lost African name. Under Elijah Muhammad's guidance, Malcolm established temples in Detroit, Philadelphia, and New York, growing the nation's membership from 400 to 40,000 during his 12 years of service. Malcolm's intellectual gifts and charismatic speaking ability made him the nation's most visible spokesperson. He articulated the anger and frustration of urban black Americans who had grown tired of the slow pace of civil rights progress, while Dr. King preached integration and nonviolence. Malcolm advocated for black nationalism, self-defense, and separation from white society. Malcolm's message resonated powerfully in the ghettos of Detroit, Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. He taught that black people didn't need to beg white people for rights that were naturally theirs. He advocated for economic independence, educational excellence, and pride in black identity and African heritage. His debates with civil rights leaders and his appearances on television and college campuses made him a national figure. Malcolm challenged black people to stop thinking of themselves as minorities, seeking handouts, and start seeing themselves as part of the global majority of non-white peoples fighting colonialism and oppression. The philosophy of black nationalism. Malcolm's teachings during his Nation of Islam years centered on several key principles that revolutionized black political thought. He preached that black Americans were not Americans but Africans who had been kidnapped and enslaved. He argued that integration was impossible because white people were inherently evil and would never accept black people as equals. Instead, Malcolm advocated for complete separation, either through the establishment of a separate black nation within America or through a return to Africa. He taught that black people needed to control their own communities, schools, businesses, and institutions. This message of self-reliance and black pride inspired a generation of young activists who would later form the Black Power movement. Malcolm also emphasized the importance of connecting the African American struggle to the broader anti-colonial movements happening across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. He helped Black Americans see themselves as part of a global struggle against white supremacy and imperialism. His advocacy for armed self-defense was particularly controversial. While he didn't advocate aggressive violence, Malcolm argued that black people had the right to defend themselves by any means necessary when attacked. This position put him at odds with the nonviolent philosophy of the mainstream civil rights movement. Growing tensions and disillusionment. By the early 1960s, Malcolm had become increasingly frustrated with the Nation of Islam's lack of involvement in the civil rights struggle. While black people were being beaten and killed in the South, Elijah Muhammad forbade nation members from participating in protests or political activities. Malcolm also began to question some of the nation's teachings, particularly its claim that all white people were devils. His expanding knowledge of Orthodox Islam and world affairs made him doubt the scientific accuracy of the nation's racial mythology. The breaking point came when Malcolm discovered that his revered teacher, Elijah Muhammad, had fathered several children with young secretaries, violating the nation's strict moral code. When Malcolm spoke privately about these revelations, he was silenced by the nation's leadership. The final break came after President Kennedy's assassination in November 1963. Despite orders to remain silent, Malcolm commented that the violence in America had come home to roost, referring to the climate of hate that had killed the president. Elijah Muhammad suspended Malcolm for 90 days, effectively ending his role in the organization he had helped build, Pilgrimage and Transformation. In March 1964, Malcolm announced his departure from the Nation of Islam and his conversion to Orthodox Sunni Islam. Shortly afterward, he embarked on the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca required of all Muslims who are able to make the journey. The pilgrimage proved transformative. In Mecca, Malcolm worshipped alongside Muslims of all races and nationalities, experiencing a unity that challenged his previous beliefs about the impossibility of racial harmony. He wrote to his followers, "Never have I witnessed such sincere hospitality and overwhelming spirit of true brotherhood as is practiced by people of all colors and races here in this ancient Holy Land." Malcolm returned from the Hajj as El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, though he continued to be known publicly as Malcolm X. His worldview had evolved significantly. While he remained committed to black nationalism and self-determination, he no longer believed that all white people were inherently evil. He began to see the struggle in terms of human rights rather than simply civil rights. The final chapter, Human Rights and Pan-Africanism. In his final year, Malcolm founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity, modeled after the Organization of African Unity. He sought to internationalize the Black American struggle by connecting it to the broader human rights movement and the anti-colonial struggles in Africa. Malcolm made several trips to Africa and the Middle East, meeting with heads of state and seeking support for bringing the United States before the United Nations on charges of human rights violations against Black Americans. He understood that American racism was part of a global system of white supremacy and believed that Black Americans needed international allies to achieve true liberation. His evolution continued until his death. Malcolm began reaching out to other civil rights leaders, including Dr. King, recognizing that unity among Black organizations was essential for progress. He also started working with white allies who genuinely supported black liberation while maintaining his commitment to black leadership and self-determination. Assassination and legacy. On February 21, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated while speaking at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem. 3 members of the Nation of Islam were convicted of the murder, though questions about the full extent of the conspiracy remain. Malcolm was just 39 years old, cut down at the height of his intellectual and political development. Malcolm's death deprived the Black liberation movement of one of its most brilliant minds and most effective organizers. However, his ideas lived on and proved prophetic. The Black Power movement of the late 1960s drew heavily on Malcolm's teachings about black pride, self-determination, and international solidarity. His autobiography, completed with Alex Haley shortly before his death, became one of the most influential books of the 20th century, inspiring millions of readers to understand the connections between personal transformation and political struggle. Enduring impact. Malcolm X's greatest contribution to Black history was his demonstration that people can change, grow, and transform themselves through education and spiritual development. His journey from street hustler to international statesman showed that no one is permanently trapped by their circumstances. Malcolm also fundamentally changed how Black Americans thought about themselves and their struggle. He taught them to see themselves as beautiful, intelligent, and capable of greatness. He connected their struggle to the global majority of non-white peoples fighting for liberation from colonialism and oppression. His emphasis on education, self-reliance, and cultural pride became central to the Black Power movement and continues to influence Black political thought today. His advocacy for human rights, rather than just civil rights, helped expand the framework for understanding racial justice. Perhaps most importantly, Malcolm X showed that the struggle for Black liberation required both personal transformation and structural change. He understood that oppressed people must first free their minds before they can free their bodies, but he also knew that individual change without collective action would never achieve full liberation. Malcolm X's life reminds us that the fight for justice requires constant growth, self-criticism, and the courage to change our minds when presented with new evidence. His legacy continues to inspire those who refuse to accept injustice and who believe in the power of ordinary people to transform themselves and their world through struggle, study, and unwavering commitment to human dignity.